see your name in the phone book. If only you knew. I've been crying since you've been gone. They should name a hurricane after you.
Welcome to timeless love stories that live beyond the ages. Tell me, have you ever loved someone forbidden to you not because of wrongdoing, but because fate, cruel and cunning, had already drawn a line you could not cross? Tonight, let us sail into the dim light of an ancient past, to wind-swept shores where the sea moans like a widow, and where two souls, not yet lovers, met for the first time under the veil of war and prophecy. The story begins not with Isolde, nor with love, but with grief. The land of Cornwall was veiled in sorrow. King Mark, noble and childless, ruled a weary kingdom shadowed by rival claims and border skirmishes. The people looked to him not just for justice, but for legacy. And though he had a nephew Tristan, child of his sister Blanchefleur Mark had not yet named him heir. Still, the boy grew beneath the king's wing, a sword in one hand, poetry in the other, bearing the fierce grace of a falcon unchained. Tristan's story, even before love, was tinged with sorrow. Born on the sea, orphaned before breath could settle in his lungs. He came into the world as his mother died, giving him life, and his father fell in battle across the channel. Raised among Cornish nobility, he became all that a knight should be: loyal, brave, beloved, yet in the silent hours of night, he would sometimes wander to the cliffs and gaze toward the distant shores of Ireland, as if summoned by something unnamed. And Ireland, oh, Ireland. Across the bitter sea lay the green, wild land ruled by King Anguish, whose name seemed carved from the fate he bore. It was a realm of fierce clans and sacred groves, of druids and darkness, and of a princess Isolde of the White Hands who was said to heal with herbs and sing with the voice of the gods. She was as much mystery as maiden, golden-haired and distant, her beauty like a candle hidden behind stained glass, something you glimpsed only in reflection, never directly. They did not know each other yet, but already they were caught in the gears of a larger design. The first thread in the tapestry of their love was not spun by tenderness, but by revenge. A champion of Ireland. Morholt, brother to Queen Isolde, had come to Cornwall demanding tribute, gold and cattle and men, as had long been paid in submission. He was a warrior terrible in might, and none dared face him. None but Tristan. He went not for glory, but for Cornwall, and for Mark, whom he loved like a second father, upon a lonely isle off the coast, where only the gulls and gods could witness. Tristan met Morholt in single combat. The clash rang like thunder over water, steel kissed steel, and blood answered. In the end, though grievously wounded, Tristan struck the fatal blow. But Morholt's blade had been poisoned, and as Tristan set sail back to Cornwall, weak and burning with fever, death clung to his shoulder like a raven. And so it was that Tristan came to Ireland. He came not as hero or conqueror, but as a broken man, drifting ashore under a false name. Tantris, carried by the tide of his own ruin. Fishermen found him and brought him to the court of Queen Isolde, who unknowingly nursed the very man who had slain her brother. And Isolde. She had seen many warriors, but something about this stranger arrested her heart. Not his strength, though he bore it well, but the silence behind his eyes. As if the sea had swallowed half his soul and returned only the part that could ache. She tended his wounds with hands that knew both sword and salve, each night. As the firelight flickered against the stone walls, she would sit beside his bed and whisper old songs of healing, and sometimes, oh, when the wind howled, he would look at her as if she were not of this world. Did he know then? Did she? No, not yet. But the thread was drawn tight. She taught him to play the harp again, as his fingers relearned their grace, and he listened when she spoke of herbs, of the moon's pull on tides, of omens and dreams. Sometimes their hands brushed when she bandaged his wounds, sometimes her voice faltered when he gazed too long. And yet nothing was spoken. There were too many walls. He was Tantris, a man without a past. She was a princess, bound by blood to the man he had slain, and somewhere deep inside she suspected, but she did not ask. Perhaps love always begins this way, not with certainty, but with the ache of not knowing. One night, when the moon bled into the sea and the harp strings trembled under his hand, she looked at him and said softly, "You speak little of where you come from." He answered only with a smile that could have meant 1,000 things or nothing at all. And outside, the sea whispered its secret tide, pushing them both slowly towards the moment it could no longer be contained. The nights in Ireland were thick with salt and secrets. Mist crept along the coast like a lover tracing forgotten skin, and within the stone keep of King Anguish's court, Tristan still, Tantris in name, healed not only in flesh but in something deeper, something that could not be bandaged or bled. And Isolde, that golden thread spun from both fire and frost, lingered. Each evening, when the others had drifted away, she would remain by his side, not because duty demanded it, but because something unspoken tethered her to this stranger. His silence, his sorrow, the way he watched her not as a princess, but as if she were a prophecy only he could read. She told him stories, not the kind sung in halls, but those passed in whispers between women tales of stars born from lovers drowned, of roses that only bloomed on graves, and he listened as if her every word were water, and he had been thirsting his whole life. Is it not strange how the heart recognizes what the mind is told to forget? One morning, as the dew still clung to the windows and the servants stirred in hushed rhythm, Isolde entered his chamber and found him staring into a polished piece of bronze, his reflection barely there. In his hand was his sword, the same one she'd helped him clean and sharpen days earlier. She stepped closer. "Does the steel speak to you?" Tristan glanced up, only in silence. He did not lie, but he did not tell the truth either. For in that silence lay the ghost of Morholt, her kin, his foe. He had come to Ireland not out of will, but need, and now, though his wounds had healed, he remained. Not because the ship was broken, but because something within him no longer wished to sail away. But time, relentless in its cruelty, does not honour love unspoken. One night, Isolde entered his chamber with eyes like a storm. In her hand she held a broken piece of iron, the tip of a sword once buried in Morholt's skull, preserved like a relic in the royal crypt. She held it beside Tristan's blade. It matched perfectly. No words passed between them for a long while. Then she whispered, "You are the man who killed my mother's brother." Tristan stood still, unblinking. Yes. Her voice cracked, not with rage, but with something worse. "Why did you come here?" "To die," he said, "but then I met you." The torch on the wall flickered. She could have screamed, called the guards, summoned vengeance from every stone in the palace. Instead, she turned her face away and said, "Leave." He bowed his head, not in guilt, but in mourning what had been born in the quiet between them, and what now must be buried alive. By dawn, Tristan was gone, not by ship, but by shadow. No goodbye, no explanation, only silence. And Ireland, once his sanctuary, closed its gates to him forever. Back in Cornwall, time moved not in days, but in echoes. Tristan returned to the court of King Mark like a man woken from sleep only to find the dream more real than the waking. He played his harp no more. He did not speak of Ireland. But in the moonlight, when the wind carried faint songs from the sea, he would sometimes whisper a name. And in Ireland, Isolde did not speak of the stranger called Tantris, but her servants noticed how she stared longer into the firelight, how her laughter dulled like a blade that no longer wished to cut. Love, it seems, does not end when lovers part. It lingers in the hollow spaces they once filled in silence, in song, in the way your heart forgets how to beat the way it used to. Seasons passed, and with them came war again, not of blades, but of alliances. King Mark, under pressure from his court and desperate to secure a legacy, sent emissaries to Ireland to propose a marriage. To Isolde, Tristan was the one chosen to go. The irony stung like frost in bone, to be sent to fetch the woman he loved for another man, but he obeyed. Because love, when true, is not a demand, it is a sacrifice. When he arrived in Ireland, the sea seemed quieter, as if mourning what it once bore, and when Isolde saw him no longer Tantris but Tristan, the Prince of Cornwall, her breath caught like a flame before the wind. She did not speak. Nor did he. But the court rejoiced, for politics is blind to longing. The terms were agreed. She would marry King Mark. For peace, for diplomacy, for honour. And on the voyage back, Isolde sat in silence. Her maid Brangain watched her with eyes that knew too much. She did not ask, but she saw. And that night, in the stillness of the cabin, a goblet was passed between Isolde and Tristan. A cup meant for husband and bride on their wedding night. A love potion crafted in secret by Isolde's mother. A drink to ensure the princess would love King Mark forever. But it was drunk by the wrong lips. By two souls already bound. And thus the love they had tried to bury returned. Not in whispers, not in dreams, but in fire. Love, when swallowed in silence, does not die, it grows teeth in the dark. By the time the ship reached the shores of Cornwall, Tristan and Isolde were no longer simply knight and princess. They were something else now, something nameless. Something that clung to them like sea salt on skin. The potion had not created love. No, love had already stirred long before. The draught had only stripped away what little resistance they had left. They did not touch, they did not kiss. But their eyes had already spoken vows no altar could contain. And yet the world did not stop for them. Cornwall welcomed Isolde with festivity and song, bells rang across castle walls, and roses were scattered like red confetti upon her path. She wore the wedding crown of the queens of old, woven with gold threads and thorns and omen, perhaps unheeded by all but the two hearts now trapped behind polite smiles and ceremonial gestures. King Mark saw her and was moved. She was beautiful, yes, but not just in form. There was a stillness in her, a deep sadness masked behind grace, like a harp string tuned too tightly. He mistook it for modesty. Tristan stood behind him, violent. He did not play the harp, he did not smile, but he bowed, and when Mark looked over his shoulder and said, "Nephew, do you not rejoice for me?" Tristan answered softly, "I rejoice for Cornwall." And then the marriage was sealed. Before God and men and laws. But what of the hearts that trembled beneath the veil? That night, as the court feasted and sang, Isolde sat at the high table beside a king she did not love, while across the room, the man she did could not meet her gaze. She raised a chalice to her lips and thought only of the first one they'd shared, the one on the ship, the one that had rewritten the marrow of her being. Brangain, her maid, watched with wary eyes. She knew what had passed. She knew it not from confession, but from the way Isolde had stood still when Tristan's name was mentioned, from the way her hands curled inward when his harp echoed from a distant corridor. A woman in love need not speak, her slumders are loud enough. And love, when bound by duty, begins to rot from the inside. In the days that followed, Isolde played the role of queen. She smiled in public, poured wine for her husband, and walked the castle gardens like a painted saint. But her soul was elsewhere, always elsewhere. With him, Tristan did not flee, nor did he stay too close. He began riding farther afield, offering to hunt for the king, to patrol the borders, to serve, and when he was gone, Isolde felt both grief and relief, grief at his absence, relief at the mercy of distance. But the heart is not soothed by absence, it is only sharpened. One evening, deep in the quiet of the castle's inner chambers, Isolde stood at her window, staring at the sea. The same sea that had brought him to her, the same sea that had stolen him away. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She did not turn, she did not need to. "Why did you come?" she asked. Tristan's voice was barely above breath, "Because I could not come." Still, she did not look at him. "You are sworn to him. And you are his wife." Now she turned. The room was lit only by the glow of a single candle, its flame flickering like a fragile heartbeat between them. Her eyes shone not with tears, but with fury at the fate that mocked them. "What have we done?" she whispered. He took a step closer. "We drank what cannot be undone." "But it wasn't the potion," she said, her voice trembling. "It was always this." "Yes," he answered, "even before we knew each other's names." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every moment unspoken, every touch withheld, every longing swallowed like a secret. She reached out and their hands met. Only that. Not lips. Not bodies. Just hands. Fingers trembling like leaves before a storm. They stood like that for what felt like a lifetime, two statues carved from yearning. And then, without a word, he turned and left. Because they knew the cost. Because love, in this world, has enemies not only in men and kings, but in laws, in duty, in honour. Because not all love is meant to be touched. But oh, how it burns. In the weeks that followed, the walls of the castle seemed to lean inward. Every glance was weighted, every meeting choreographed like a masquerade. They became shadows of themselves, hollow during the day, haunted at night. And still, they said nothing. But love, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves footprints. And soon, whispers began to gather like a smoke. The Queen does not smile as she should. The King's nephew grows pale with each feast. The harp in the great hall is silent. And Brangain, who knew more than most, feared that silence would not be enough to protect them. If you were Isolde, wearing a crown forged not of gold but of quiet anguish, would you have chosen differently? Perhaps not. For love is not always a choice. Sometimes it is the thread that finds you, winds through your veins, and refuses to loosen even as you kneel before another. And so she lived between two worlds. By daylight, a queen poised, soft-voiced, generous. She walked beside King Mark in the gardens, her hand resting upon his arm like a dove nesting upon a branch. The people adored her. They believed she had brought peace across the sea, an Irish rose blooming in Cornish soil. But in the chambers of her solitude she bloomed only in memory. And Tristan, he wore his taulets like armour. The court spoke of his loyalty, his service, his virtue. They did not see how each accolade was another stone on his chest. He did not speak of Ireland, nor of the potion, nor of the flame that burned behind his ribs like an eternal hearth. He dared not. And yet love always finds its way to speak. It speaks in glances that linger too long, in breaths held when footsteps approach, in letters never written, but imagined 100 times. It was Brangain who bore the weight of it most. She alone knew the truth. She had watched her mistress's joy flicker into stillness, her nights turn restless, and one day, when the Queen sat motionless before her mirror, Brangain knelt beside her and asked, "Shall I speak it aloud, or will you—" Isolde's lips parted, but no sound came, just a tear, silent, defiant, as if weeping were a rebellion against the throne. "He comes at night sometimes," Brangain continued, "to stand in the garden, not to see you, just to be near." Isolde looked down. "He is a ghost in daylight." "And you," the maid whispered, "are a ghost in silk." But ghosts, as any poet knows, cannot remain invisible forever. One summer evening, a celebration was held in the forest glades beyond the castle. Nobles from distant lands came to feast and watch falcons dance through the sky. Mark, proud of his wife and nephew, invited them all to witness the splendour of his court. Tristan was tasked with overseeing the hunt. Isolde rode beside the king, her gown trailing like mist behind her horse. The woods, sun-dappled and fragrant with pine and rose, seemed like a place outside of time where the past could not find them, and duty might slumber for a while. There, in that hush between laughter and horn, it happened. She dismounted to gather wildflowers beneath a canopy of birch, alone, for just a moment, and Tristan, leading his steed nearby, turned and saw her there crowned in shadow and sunlight as if the forest itself had chosen her. She did not speak. Nor did he. But he stepped toward her, and she, with fingers trembling, offered him a single violet bloom. the gentlest act. And yet it was enough. A hunter in the distance saw it, a flicker of something too tender, too private. And thus the whisper found its wings. By twilight the feast was bedewed with unease. Mark noticed it in the way his courtiers looked not at him, but at one another, in the way silence clung to the corners of laughter, as if all merriment was stained. Later, in his chambers, he summoned a single trusted knight, Lord Andret, ever watchful, ever ambitious. "What do they say?" Mark asked. Andret hesitated, then bowed his head. "They say that your nephew's service is too loyal, that the Queen's eyes wander when the harp plays, that perhaps—" He paused, the silence crueler than words. Mark's face did not change, but something within him shifted like a page turning in a book written by sorrow. That night, the king said nothing to Isolde. He kissed her brow with the gentleness of a man unsure of his own hands, and to Tristan he merely offered wine and song. But trust once cracked lets in the wind, and that wind grew colder with each passing day. Tristan began to feel it, the way his name was spoken less, the way Mark's eyes lingered too long, too quietly. He spoke to no one, but Brangan saw the shadows deepen beneath his eyes, and Isolde, once silent, began to smile too brightly. Sometimes the only way to hide grief is to paint it with gold. But no court remains blind forever. And so it was that a plan was made. One night, as the moon rose heavy and red above the castle walls, Tristan received a message, a note without name or seal, only 6 words. "Come, the Queen waits in silence." It was left in his chamber, folded beside his sword. He read it, and though he knew the risk, he did not hesitate. He crossed the garden where they first met after the wedding, where he had once touched her hand beneath the candle's trembling light. And as he entered the secluded chamber at the edge of the tower, the place she often came to pray, he found not Isolde, but men. Knights waiting in silence. Andret stepped forward. "Your loyalty, cousin," he said coldly, "is no longer beyond question." And before Tristan could speak, the door behind him closed. Love had been a thread. Now it had become a snare. If you were Tristan, standing alone in that chamber, with steel drawn against your breath and love named as your crime, would you have denied it? He did not. Not with the words, at least. But when they came at him with accusation instead of sword, when Andret's voice coiled through the silence like a snake, "Did you love her?" Tristan merely lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in a kind of weary reverence, as if the answer itself was holy and beyond the reach of courts. They seized him before dawn, not like a knight, but like a traitor. His arms bound, his sword taken, in the courtyard, beneath the hush of early mist. The guards whispered prayers behind clenched teeth. Even they could not meet his eyes. For who could gaze upon a man punished not for betrayal, but for love? And Isolde? She was kept unaware. Mark ordered it so. He could not bear to see her break, not yet. In his heart still echoed the gentleness of her laughter, the weight of her head resting once on his shoulder. He clung to that memory like a man trying to save a dying flame with his bare hands. But even kings cannot stop time. Brangain heard first from the cook, from the servant girl, from the boy who cleaned the stables and had seen blood on a blade not used in hunting. She ran to her mistress's chambers in the blue light of morning. "They've taken him." Isolde turned slowly. "Who?" "Your heart." The silence cracked like ice beneath them. And so, while Mark sat in judgment, torn between fury and ache, Isolde dressed in mourning white and no one questioned it, no one dared. She descended to the great hall as if descending to a tomb. The lords gathered. The stone walls trembled with the weight of unspoken things. Tristan stood before them, unshaven, bruised, but unbroken. His hands were no longer bound, perhaps as a courtesy or a final mercy before the blade. Mark rose, and when he spoke, it was not with anger, but with something colder sorrow that had turned rigid like old iron. "You are my son," he said. "You are my trust." Tristan bowed his head. "I still am, but I am also hers." The murmur in the court grew sharp, a blade of disbelief drawn too quickly. Mark's hands trembled. "Then why did you not run?" "I did," Tristan whispered, "every day from my own heart." The words hung there, luminous and heavy, like candles flickering in a windless church. Isolde stepped forward. All eyes turned. She did not weep, she did not plead. She simply said, "I loved no man before him, and shall love none after." Andret scoffed, "Is this love or treason?" But no one answered. For what law could undo what had already taken root? Mark looked at them, his nephew, his queen, and saw not betrayal, but tragedy. Two souls, neither proud nor ashamed, only tired, only true. He turned his back, and when he spoke again, his voice was thin with something like defeat. "I will not have your blood stain this court," he said to Tristan. "You shall be exiled forever, and if you return, you die. Then to Isolde you will remain queen, you will wear your crown, and you will forget." She did not nod, she did not speak. Only her hands trembled at her sides, bare, unheld. By nightfall, Tristan was gone. He did not bid her farewell. There were no final embraces, only a harp left behind in her chamber, its strings untuned, as though even music had decided to mourn in silence. He rode through the forest alone. Through the glens and hollow hills of Cornwall, where they had once laughed beside the river, where their fingers had brushed in secret. He did not look back, for he knew that if he did, he would turn to stone. And Isolde, she returned to her chambers and lay upon the bed where she had never once slept in joy, the crown still upon her brow, as if to remind her that her love had been real because it had cost everything. Outside, the rain began to fall. It fell for hours, days, as though the heavens themselves were ashamed. In the weeks that followed, the court returned to its rhythms, feasts were held, bells rang. Mark smiled again, though the laughter never quite reached his eyes. But Isolde's face grew pale as the moon. She walked as if floating, unanchored by the world. She answered with softness, obeyed with grace, but spoke only when spoken to. Only Brangan knew that each night she traced the carving on the harp's wood a falcon in flight and whispered his name like a rosary. And somewhere, across the sea, Tristan wandered through lands foreign and cruel, through forests where no name could follow. Each step he took with her shadow beside him. He was not free. He had only exchanged one prison for another. And though they breathed apart, they lived in the same sorrow. Two halves of a vow the world had no space to keep. When love is torn from the body, does the soul not limp forever? Years passed. Though time for Tristan and Isolde did not pass, it settled, like dust on pages that could no longer be turned. They were not lovers anymore, nor companions, not even memories in each other's arms, but still something remained. A pulse beneath exile, a murmur beneath vows. He wandered. She waited. And both, in their way, began to fade. Tristan crossed the waters to Brittany, the land of cliffs and moors, where knights bore different colours and bards sang of other kings. He fought under Duke Hoel, a just man with tired eyes, and his valour returned him honour but not peace. That part of him had been buried on Cornish soil, where her footprints were still pressed into the grass. In time, Duke Hoel entrusted him with more than war. A daughter. Isolde of the White Hands. Her name an echo. Her gaze soft and unfamiliar. She nursed him through wounds from a distant raid, brought him tea brewed with herbs he could not name, and looked upon him not as a hero but as a man trying to outrun the sea. He did not speak of Ireland, nor Cornwall, nor love. But one night, as he stood on the battlement staring toward the horizon, she said, "You walk like someone who forgets where the ground is." He smiled, just faintly. "I once flew." The court grew fond of the tale, the noble knight and the gentle lady. Whispers of marriage circled them like birds preparing to nest. Tristan, weary of silence, weary of drifting, looked into her eyes and saw not Isolde, but kindness, a kindness that did not ask questions. And so he agreed. Not out of joy, but exhaustion. They were wed in a chapel of stone and ivy, with a single bell tolling low in the mist. Isolde wore white, not unlike the queen whose name she shared, and when Tristan kissed her hand, he did so with reverence but no fire. She did not ask for it. She only asked for presence. Babson. And yet, on their wedding night, he did not touch her. He sat instead beside the hearth, playing his harp, the same melody over and over. She watched him from the bed and said, "Is there a name for the woman in that song?" He shook his head. There is no name left, only music. Back in Cornwall, Isolde of Ireland kept her silence. The years had not withered her beauty, only made it more solemn. She became known not for laughter or extravagance, but for her stillness, how she listened when others spoke, how she moved like wind through a ruined chapel. Mark aged beside her. He grew gentler. Perhaps, or simply tired. They shared meals, shared burdens of court, but never shared a bed in warmth. Whatever love he had once hoped for had turned into a kind of penance. He never spoke of Tristan, and she never asked. Yet there were days when she would walk to the edge of the cliffs, where the gulls circled and the air smelled of salt and longing, and she would stare east toward Brittany. Brangan watched her with quiet grief. She once offered to send word, but Isolde only said, "If he's alive, he remembers. If he forgets, then the message would be crueler than silence." But Tristan had not forgotten. How could he? Though married, he walked beside Isolde like a man holding a candle beside a sun he could no longer touch, and though she was gentle, she knew she shared her life with a ghost. Still, she bore it. She did not rage nor cry. She only waited for the day he might truly return to her. That day never came. Instead, a blade did. A poisoned tip buried in Tristan's side during a skirmish meant to be brief. The wound festered. No salve, no chant, no priestly hand could heal what had sunk too deep. As he lay fevered, slipping between pain and dream, he spoke her name aloud. Not Isolde, but Isolde. Again and again, like a prayer to a forgotten god. His wife wept beside. But he did not see her. He only saw green cliffs and golden hair and a single violet bloom offered beneath birch leaves. At last, his friend Cahedin said, "We must send for her." A ship was prepared, and with it, a plan born of desperation. "If she comes," Tristan whispered, "let the sail be white. If she refuses, let it be black." Cahedin nodded. And so the message was sent across the sea to Cornwall, to the queen who had not forgotten, to the woman who had once offered her soul in Sonder and never asked for it back. "Come, if love remains," the letter read, "he is dying." And as the wind carried that plea, Isolde stood once more upon the cliffs, her hands cold with memory. She said nothing to Mark. She said nothing to Brangain. She simply packed one cloak, one ring, and stepped aboard the vessel without a single word. The sea opened for her, because some love cannot die without one last touch. What is love, if not the memory of a touch carried across oceans, past time, past ruin? The ship cut through the grey waters like a prayer with wings. Isolde stood at its prow, her cloak wrapped tight around her, not for warmth, but to hold in the trembling of her bones. She did not speak, not to the sailors, not to Brangain who stood behind her like a shadow, not even to the wind that pressed against her cheeks like the hands of a long-lost friend. Every wave whispered him. Every gust held his name. Tristan. Back in Brittany, he lay in the fevered dusk between life and something quieter. The wound had opened again. The poison worked its slow art, curling through his blood like ivy climbing toward the heart. He no longer opened his eyes. He no longer moved his lips. Only his hands stirred, sometimes twitching as if grasping for something not there. Isolde of the white hands watched with a stillness that was not born of peace, but of realization. She knew. She had always known. And now, knowing it would end with her standing beside a man whose heart had always been far from her reach, she felt the sting not of betrayal, but of the kind of sorrow reserved for those who had waited with too much hope. The castle watched. All Brittany seemed to hold its breath. And one day, a servant boy ran in from the cliffs. "A ship," he cried, "a ship approaches, the sail is." But his voice was swallowed in silence. It was Cahedin who climbed to the tower first. The sea was calm, the light slanting through the mist like gold washed in morning. And there she was. The ship. The sail. White. As the clouds parted and sunlight struck the fabric, it glowed like a swan's wing in flight, a ghost made holy by memory. Cahedin turned, raced to the chamber where Tristan lay, and knelt beside him. "She's coming," he whispered. "The sail is white." For a moment, nothing. Then, a breath. Tristan's chest lifted ever so faintly, and his eyes, those eyes dulled by days of pain, fluttered open, like a candle trying to remember flame. "She is coming?" he asked. His voice was brittle, worn thin by waiting. "Yes," Cahedin said. "She's almost here." A pause. And then, with the last strength left in his bones, Tristan whispered, "Take me to the window." They carried him not with pomp, but with reverence to the open arch where he might see the sea one final time. And there, on the horizon, the white sail drew near. Closer. Brighter. Until he could almost believe the sail was her hair, flowing behind her, that the ship itself was her arms, returning to gather him from the fire of the world. He closed his eye and waited. But fate, ever cruel, had not finished its song. Isolde of the White Hands stood in the doorway, unnoticed at first. She had heard the boy, she had seen the sail. She had seen her husband's eyes light not for her, but for the ghost he'd carried through their marriage. She did not scream, she did not strike. She only spoke 4 words. "The sail is black." Cahedin turned. "What?" She said nothing more, only looked at her husband, the man she had lain beside, wept beside, waited for and chose her wound. "The sail is black," she said again, soft, final. And in Tristan's ears the words fell like thunder. He opened his eyes just once more. "Black," he whispered. And with that word he let go. Of hope. Of breath. Of everything. When Isolde arrived, moments later, her feet barely touching the ground, her arms open, her mouth already shaping his name, she found him still. Still as stone, still as grief, still as every night she had spent listening for his name in the wind. She did not scream. She did not weep. She only crumpled beside him, as if her body had been held together by the hope of reaching him, and now, with that hope broken, she too began to break. She held his hand. She kissed his brow. She lay beside him as though the wedding night fate denied them had simply waited until death. And in the hush that followed, she whispered, "I am here." The others left the room. All but Brangen. Night came, and Isolde did not rise. She lay beside him until her breath grew soft, her pulse slower than the sea. And when morning found them, they were still together. At last. Have you ever stood where sorrow has settled so deeply, even the stones seem to mourn? The chapel bells tolled in Brittany not for war, not for feast, but for 2 bodies that would not rise again, the knight who fought without fear, and the queen who loved without regret. They were laid side by side in silence, wrapped in white linen, their fingers just brushing in the space between. A hush fell over the court. No one spoke of betrayal anymore. No one dared. Even Isolde of the White Hands did not weep aloud. Her eyes were hollow, her hands folded like wilted lilies in her lap. She stood beside the grave, a woman not robbed by fate but dismissed by it, as if her love had been a miswritten line in a poem already finished. Mark came days later. Word of Isolde's death had reached Cornwall not by messenger, but by the ache in his own bones. He travelled without escort, cloaked and bowed, crossing sea and storm like a man drawn not by duty, but by something much older, grief, perhaps, or the need to say goodbye to the version of himself that once believed love could be owned. He stood before their resting place, eyes dull with years. And there they were. 2 marble stones carved with no titles, no crowns, just names. Tristan. Isolde. A rose had been planted above her grave, a vine above his. And as if by spell or mercy, the vine reached across the stone between them, curling its green tendrils into the thorns of the rose, weaving together in silence. The people came to see it. How, day by day, the rose grew brighter and the vine stronger, how they twined tighter, as if even in death, something refused to let go. The priest debated it. Miracle. Magic. But the poets already knew. They wrote songs not about kings or glory or victory, but about 2 souls who had loved without the permission of the world, and whose bodies, though buried in separate soil, refused separation still. One legend said that Mark, in secret, returned a second time long after he had aged into silence and placed his own sword between the graves, to stop the vines from touching. The next morning the blade was rusted through. Love had corroded even iron. Another tale claimed Brangan came each spring to whisper their story to the blossoms, ensuring that no part of it was forgotten, that her words fed the roots. But no tale was needed. The graves told it all. 2 lovers, 2 stones, 1 rose, 1 vine. Bound. Even now. In Cornwall, the sea sang softer for a while. The cliffs bore their names, etched not by hand but by time. The harp Tristan had left behind remained untouched in Isolde's chamber, its strings humming faintly in the wind, as if still remembering the melody he played on the night he could not sleep. And in Brittany, children gathered near the tomb and asked their mothers, "Why does the rose grow that way?" And the answer always came not in law, nor scripture, nor fear, but in a whisper. Because love knows no grave. Night falls softer in places where great love has died. And in Brittany, the wind that once howled like wolves now moved gently through the chapel ruins, tracing the vines that crept along Tristan's tomb, teasing the petals of the rose that bloomed over Isolde. It was as if nature itself had learned to hush in reverence, afraid to disturb what even time could not undo. Children no longer ran the laughing past the graves. They came with flowers, with questions, with stories their grandmothers whispered by firelight of ships with white sails, of potions mistaken for fate, of music played not for joy but to keep sorrow company. In these stories, the world did not end with death. In these stories, love never needed a roof, a law, or a crown. Only a name spoken in the dark. Tristan. Isolde. Their names, when spoken, seemed to slow the breath, as if the syllables themselves asked for silence. Not far from the chapel, Brangan grew old in a stone cottage surrounded by lavender and ash trees. She never returned to Ireland, though many letters were sent for her. Instead, she remained near them not to guard, but to remember. People came often, asking for stories. Were they saints, some asked. No, she'd smile, they were lovers, and that is harder. Others asked if she regretted helping them, if she felt guilt, shame, fear. But Brangan had learned that to love someone truly is never something to regret, even when it ends in ruin, even when it must be hidden beneath cloaks and shadows. Especially then. And sometimes, when the dusk turned violet and the stars blinked open one by one, she would walk to the graves and speak aloud not to the dead, but to the story itself. "You're safe," she would say. "I've kept you safe." One winter, the snow fell so quietly that the world seemed wrapped in parchment. That year, no one visited the tombs for weeks. When the frost melted in spring, the rose had not died. Its bloom was smaller, yes, but brighter, as if it had weathered grief and grown more certain of itself. Poets from across the seas came to write of the place. Some embellished it, claiming the rose grew thorns that sang, or that the vine wept each full moon. But the true magic, the quiet magic, was in its stillness. Nothing had moved, and yet everything had changed. In Cornwall, Mark's reign came to an end. He passed in sleep, a silver circlet beside him. His last breath whispered not to a priest or to God, but to her name. Isolde. Not in bitterness, not in blame, but in release. For though he had once tried to control her story, he had come at last to understand some hearts are born under different stars, and to love someone is not always to keep them. Sometimes it is to let them belong to something higher, something unreachable. Kahedin, too, aged by the sea, he became a man of wandering silences, known more for his listening than for speech. When asked what Tristan's last words were, he would never answer, not because he forgot, but because they were not his to give. Years blurred the lines between memory and myth. Was the potion truly a mistake? Did they love before they drank it? Did Isolde die of sorrow or peace? No one could say for certain. But the truth was never in the details. The truth was in the ache. In the way strangers who'd never known them held hands tighter when walking past the graves. In the way lovers pressed foreheads together and whispered, "I would have sailed for you." Because that was what they were, in the end. Not just a story, but a mirror of all that love dares to become when the world says no. Of all that endures when even the body cannot. Of what it means to say, "I saw you, I knew you, and I never let go." So tell me, if your love was bound to be torn apart, would you still choose to live it, even for a moment, even if it left your soul with no home but memory? Tonight, their story ends, but not in silence, not in sorrow, but in the hush of something eternal. The graves of Tristan and Isolde, once marked only by the entwined rose and vine, faded into legend, the stone eroded, the names weathered into moss, and yet the place was never truly forgotten. Travellers still came, not to ask questions, not to leave prayers, but simply to stand, to feel, remember. Because in that place, time held its breath. Lovers found each other's hands more easily. Old men wept without shame. And poets, even the young ones, wrote their best verses with salt in their throats. Not one poem could capture them. Not fully, not the rage of their parting, not the stillness of their return, not the tenderness of the hand Isolde laid on Tristan's heart the moment before hers ceased to beat. But even so, the world tried, and in trying kept them alive. In Ireland, the bards still sing of the princess who knew the names of every herb, who could heal with a glance and yet could not heal the wound in her own chest. In Cornwall, they tell tales of the prince who chose exile over betrayal and love over loyalty, and how his silence echoed louder than any war cry. And in Brittany, the people still say that if you sit beneath the old rose tree at dusk and close your eyes, you might hear it. The softest sound, like breath against a lover's neck, like a harp string in the moment after it's touched. The sound of a love that never truly ended. And the sea remembers. It carries their names in its foam. It sings their parting with each tide. And when the wind rises, it does not wail. It whispers. It whispers what we, in all our hurried lives, forget to say often enough. That love, true love, is not measured by time or triumph. It is measured by how deeply it carves us, by what it leaves behind in the hush, by the echo we carry long after the last embrace. So if you ever find yourself near the edge of the world, where the grass grows wild and the horizon aches, listen carefully. You might hear her, or him, or both. Not in words, but in the quiet promise that they were here, that they loved, and that we are never truly alone when we remember. Good night, Tristan. Good night, Isolde. And to you, dear listener, good night.